Hello and welcome to the Thoroughbred Breeders Podcast, brought to you by the Thoroughbred Breeders Association. I'm Naomi Mellor, CEO of the TBA, and it's my pleasure to be your host today. At the TBA, we are here to support you, to help you learn, to nurture your interest, and to answer any questions you may have as you breed, care for, and maintain your passion for these wonderful animals. We're also all about growing the fantastic community that exists in thoroughbred breeding, wherever you are in the world. In each episode, we'll be discussing developments, news, stories, and experiences, and helping you to feel connected to our work and your community. You can follow us on socials at thetba.gb, and do feel free to email us. We'd love to hear from you, and we're at info@thetba.co.uk. Now, on with the show. Hello. I'm pretty sure I mentioned in the last episode how quickly time was flying by, but remarkably it is now the end of May, which means that it's the Oaks and the Derby next week. Very exciting, and we are looking forward to that. We're also looking towards the time of year when foals are getting bigger and more independent here in the Northern Hemisphere, and your thinking might be turning towards weaning, which is both a nutritional and social transition for young thoroughbreds. It's a big topic, but I was joined once again by Jo Grimwade to discuss. If you are interested in the subject of weaning, Jo helped to write a really excellent course that we have on TB Ed about this, which is called Weaning the Thoroughbred Foal. So if you are interested in learning and having a proper deep dive about weaning, I would strongly recommend you go and have a look at that. There is also a blog on the topic on the TB Ed website as well, which Molly has very kindly linked to in the show notes below. So do have a look at that if you want to have a quick read. And if you want a bit more information, then go and have a look at TB Ed. So weaning. We all, I think, should know roughly what that is. But Jo, we need to plan and prepare quite carefully for weaning in mares and foals. And we're going to run through a few pertinent points today. At the top line, what would you sort of say is the biggest thing that people need to know when they first get into it, weaning? What would be your kind of big headline on weaning if people are starting to breed for the first time, or it's a new topic for them?
I think one of the difficulties, Naomi, is that there isn't a right and a wrong, and it's very difficult to find the most appropriate way for your own setup. So I've always been incredibly lucky to be working with quite large numbers of foals and weaning by setting them into groups of sort of 6 to 8 foals and taking out mares steadily over a period. It's such a great way to do it. But, I know not everybody's set up for that. So there are all sorts of ways of doing it. It can be done from the paddock, it can be done from the stable, and it's really working out what's the best system for you to absolutely minimize the stress through the process, because our key aim is to make sure that the foal in particular just keeps growing. They have these extraordinarily constant growth patterns through the first sort of couple of years of life, and it's trying to keep them on the correct line. And my experience is that if they're not weaned properly, you get a little bit of a dip off that line. Mm-hmm. Their growth rate is interrupted, which in itself isn't a major problem. But then you get a period of compensatory growth after that, which is what causes the problem. So, the big aim is to absolutely minimize stress, and there are lots of ways of doing it.
Yeah, definitely. Because actually that drop off is seen across lots of different species. If you're producing cows for meat, for example, they will talk quite readily about having a kind of growth drop after weaning. And it's a well-recognized thing that stress point can be quite impactful for little ones. So obviously we wanted to really minimize the stress as part of the weaning process for both mares and foals, but particularly for foals. So in terms of planning, Jo, you mentioned it's quite dependent on facilities, horse numbers, little friendship groups. How would you suggest that people on studs of different sizes go about thinking about what might suit them? Because obviously there's different systems for different people.
No, absolutely. And I think whatever you're doing, you nearly always want to have a build-up period into it. So if you're paddock weaning, it's getting your group really settled. So when you start taking mares away, as much of the environment remains the same for the foal as you can possibly achieve. I think, another sort of key thing, it's a huge help if you can get the mare out of earshot when the moment of weaning comes. And if that's a case of speaking to a sort of neighbouring stud and saying, would you mind if you take our mare for 2 or 3 days after weaning, that can help. So just make sure you've got everything set up and ready to go, and you're clear in your own mind how you're going to proceed. And just keep everything as gradual for the foal as you possibly can. I think the older mares are sometimes quite glad when weaning comes around. but you get all sorts, don't you? You get the very noisy ones.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you see them, they're like, no, not my child, off you go. Yeah. See, once they are weaned, then their accessibility to milk is taken away. So how do we suggest, or what do we think about managing the kind of hard feed progression? How do you suggest people go about with that?
I think the interesting thing, the nutritionist will advise us to think that after sort of 3 months, the milk is pretty falling short of meeting the foal's nutritional requirements. So, naturally they're picking at a bit of grass and they're picking a bit of mum's food, and that's going to help to bridge the gap. But then when the milk's going to stop completely, you really want the foal taking a considerable amount of hard feed. And you get this dilemma. When the foal's about 3 months old, its nutritional requirements are going to be enormously different to the mare's. So most people use a system called creep feeding, which is a setup which allows the foal to gain access to the feed, but not the mare's. And there are several ways of doing it, which we go through in the course on TB Ed. And I think it not only helps the foals so that you don't get a major nutritional change when the milk suddenly stops. I think it also helps the mares to dry out as well, although I haven't got any scientific evidence for that. But it's just, good practice.
And often people are doing that anyway, that you'll see foals nipping into their mum's bucket from time to time from a relatively young age. And I think people are often surprised by how inquisitive and how much they're prepared to try when they're quite little, surprisingly little, that they will get in on a bit of hard feed.
Definitely. Even sort of when they're a week old, you see them chewing on a bit of hay and whatever. There isn't much nutritional value coming out of it, but they're experimenting and they're starting to get the idea of taking in hard feed.
Yeah, it's good. And so on that, when they are then growing and we're feeding them hard feed, one of the ways that we can keep an eye on the impact of weaning is by looking at their weights. Regular weighing of foals is a really good idea, and not everybody has access to a weigh bridge, and I appreciate that completely. But do you just want to chat a little bit about when you should start weighing foals, how often, how do we recommend doing that, etc., Jo? Just let's have a chat about weighing and how we can measure the impact of weaning through that.
Yeah, I think partly because we were looking after a lot of other people's mares and foals when I was in stud management, we found weighing a really good way to keep clients informed. So, rather than saying, oh, your foal's doing fine, you can actually say, this is the foal's growth chart and this is what it's doing. And we'd weigh at birth, we'd weigh after a week. And there's a massive management benefit in photographing the foal newborn and photographing the foal at a week, because everybody thinks you're brilliant. The foal has completely sort of changed and it's fantastic. And then every 4 weeks was the policy we adopted. We would tighten that up a little bit when we were experimenting with different weaning methods. We'd tighten that up a little bit and weigh every week over the weaning period. And look carefully for sort of drops and actually using sort of creep feeds and paddock weaning, we could pretty much eliminate any dip in the growth over weaning, which was so pleasing.
It's amazing, and actually probably really satisfying to have the numbers to prove that you're getting that steady increase and that you're not seeing any kind of regression through the practices that you're using. That must be very very pleasing and satisfying.
It lets you know you're on the right track.
Definitely. And on that, we said that the point of all of this is to reduce stress. In terms of indicators of stress, some of them are very obvious, vocalization being one of them. But can you talk a little bit about what are the other indicators that people might want to look for, or that you might have already noticed as a stud owner or somebody working on a stud? How worried should we be about different things, Jo, and what are the biggies, do you reckon?
I think it's a really sort of interesting area, and there's quite a lot of research going on in that area. Using cortisol to sort of monitor stress. But the sort of signs we're looking out for, foals who aren't getting fully incorporated into the group. You don't feel like they're one of the gang. They're always a little bit off on the side, and maybe they come a little bit harder to handle. And if in the longer term, if you're getting stereotypical behaviour, box walking, wind sucking, one of the things I'd think was this rooted in the weaning? Was it because we made a mistake at weaning? Although I'll also say, the stereotypical behaviour, oddly enough, can be genetic. I'm absolutely convinced of that. Reduced appetite. Even if you're not weighing, I think you'll fairly quickly see that they're not thriving. And you've got to be so careful that you don't start to set up ulcers, which can then have quite a long-term negative effect. One thing I'd say is don't worry too much about snotty noses. Having just had a grandson go through starting school, I'm well familiar with how prickly viruses can get spread around. And the snotty noses are the horse building up a bit of natural immunity. A little trick we used at Sandringham, we put echinacea in the creep feed.
Did you? Wow.
We felt, again, not scientific, and I'm sorry it wasn't, but we did feel it reduced the severity of the autumn snotty noses. If you've got snotty noses, take temperatures, monitor for coughing, but Naomi, you're the vet, tell me if I'm wrong, but the snotty nose on its own, don't beat yourself up about it.
No, I think the nursery and school starting analogy is quite a good one, Joe, that whether you're young or old, when you start socially mixing and you're a relatively naive immunity, yes, there are a lot of things that go around which hopefully won't be anything serious, and are rapidly dealt with by the very amazing human or equine body. I would agree completely on all of that. And on that one, you just mentioned really briefly in passing about using cortisol. Lots of people will have heard of cortisol as a stress hormone. What do we know about measuring cortisol levels as a measure of stress in foals? I realise this is quite a new research area, Joe. Some of the results are a bit contradictory, but can you just expand on that very briefly?
Yeah, no, that was my feeling, Naomi. They were trying to analyse the different methods of weaning and using cortisol as the marker for the degree of stress that the foal was experiencing. But it did get a little bit contradictory. So, some people believed in step-by-step weaning, where the foal progressively is taken away from the mare for longer periods, and that was one area where the research came up on both sides of the argument. So I'm not quite sure. One thing I found really interesting was the research suggests that having an older horse within the group of weanlings can be very beneficial, which I sort of completely understand. And that could be a retired mare, or it could be a quiet old gelding that's not going to give them too much stick, but just keep them in line. And on the occasions I've seen it, I can quite believe that that's a real positive. And that might be very helpful for people who have a very limited number of foals. If you've only got 3 or 4, 2 or 3 foals, then that might be a way just to put an extra steadying influence into the weaned group.
I used to have a client who had a very small number of foals and weaned them all with a Shetland pony. And it was certainly taught them some manners, let's put it that way anyway.
And I've said that slightly wrong. Don't introduce the older horse into the wean group. Have the older horse introduced into the group before you wean, and then it'll be a great influence on the wean group.
No, definitely. And in terms of that, establishing social groups, some larger studs with lots of foals have very well established programs for this. But for smaller numbers, how do people go about establishing those groups, making sure that the pecking order is okay, that nobody's being bullied, that everybody's happy? Any advice on social groupings, and what about fillies and colts together, Joe, as well? How much do we need to worry about that?
I think that's really difficult, and it's where I've been so lucky dealing in larger numbers. If you've only got 2 or 3 foals, and especially if one was born in February and one was born in May, it makes it incredibly complicated. And you quite often see people at the foal sales say, I've got to buy a filly to pair up with one at home. And I'd love to see people being cooperative with other breeders in their area, seeing if they can pull their resources a little bit. I think that would be hugely helpful, because to my mind, foals do better in larger groups. And then the idea of dividing the sexes at the same time as weaning or prior to weaning is that it saves one more post-disturbance to the groups later on. And certainly by the spring, possibly a little bit earlier, if you've got precocious sorts, you need to have your boys separated from the girls. But if you've got small numbers, it's very tricky, and I just sort of suggest ask for help, see if you can find people who can share facilities and the process.
And as ever, if anyone listening to this does need help, we are here. So do give us a ring, and we can definitely help to point you in the right direction. And that is one of the things that the TBA is definitely here for, is for advice and help. So do pick up the phone if you need anything. And just lastly, Jo, we've talked quite a lot about foals there. We haven't touched on mares. Weaning can be stressful for mamas too. What do we need to know about mares in terms of their condition, their weight, their stress, everything about their life in the run-up and the aftermath of weaning as well?
So certainly I felt with the mares, you didn't want to be stuffing food into them and encouraging them to produce milk prior to weaning. Give them a chance to reduce their milk production just by controlling their nutrition. They wouldn't normally need a massive amount of nutrition at that stage unless they've taken a very long time to conceive and they're getting into the latter stages of the next pregnancy. They only really need a maintenance diet. Don't have them on the lushest grass. And always try to avoid milking off. I completely understand milking off sometimes is necessary, and it's far better than letting your mare get mastitis. But the natural process is that the udder gets full, and being full, that reduces the milk production and helps the mare to dry off. So by milking off, you're almost sort of encouraging them to carry on lactating. If you are milking off, cleanliness, because we are just trying to avoid the dreaded mastitis. When you're checking your mares, have a look at the udder, make sure it's not sort of grossly engorged. Look for their action. They'll quite quickly lose their hind action when they get a little bit of mastitis. So keep a close eye out for that. I wouldn't be afraid to put mares on a horse walker or things like that to get them walking a bit and just helping with the process. I know some people withhold water. Now, personally, I don't like the idea of that. Water's so essential to them. I wouldn't try and restrict their water personally.
But in terms of checking udders, if you're starting to get early signs of mastitis, that if they're very hot, they're very painful, they're quite swollen, I think just daily checking, getting your mares used to having their udder checked, which I'm sure they will anyway, because people will be checking their udders during pregnancy, but definitely feeling the bag in the run-up and after weaning as well is never a bad option. Any final nuggets of wisdom, Jo, as well?
Well, I wish I could wave a magic wand, but it's always a process that makes you a little bit nervous.
Yeah, of course.
In the majority of cases, once you've established a system that works for you, you will find it can be incredibly untraumatic and happy day.
And you see them with their little friends, and once they've established their groups or they've got their companion of any size or shape, then they've really formed those bonds and actually done well. Weaning doesn't have to be a hugely traumatic experience for everybody involved, human and equine.
And watch them in the paddock. You'll see them starting the process on their own.
Definitely. And like I said, any questions, comments, or issues that you're having, do just give us a ring. TBEd is full of the information that you need, so do go and have a look at that as well. In the meantime, Jo, thank you. This will not be your last appearance on this podcast, I don't think, but for now, thank you, and we'll see you soon.
It's a pleasure.
Hear me out on this one, but next we are going to talk about health and safety. Safe working is an essential part of all of our lives at work these days, and never more so than when we are around horses. We all know that the animals we adore come with certain risks attached, but there are ways to mitigate these risks and some basics that you should know. I was joined by the TBA's health and safety consultant, Sue Corrin, to chat a little further on this.
And she's worked for some really interesting clients over the years. The FA, she's worked in cricket for the MCC, she's worked for Channel 4, she's got loads of media clients, she does work in horse racing, and she's got massive equestrian knowledge and background as well. So she is a huge perk to TBA members, which is kind of why we're chatting today. Before we get started on all of that though, Sue, how did you get into health and safety? Because I feel like it's not your average career path. When you leave school, you want to be like, I want to be a health and safety advisor. How did you get started in all of this?
Cool. I actually started off life as a nurse and worked in intensive care an accident emergency, and I actually wanted to do the ITU course. And so I was looking for, you have to have several lots of experience in different areas before you apply back in the day. And at the back of the Nursing Times, the degree that I decided to undertake was actually advertised. And I thought, that sounds really interesting. So I actually have a degree in occupational hygiene,
Okay.
which is health and safety, but with other things like toxicology and measuring contaminants, working outside, working upside down, working at extreme temperatures and radiation. So it's a little bit more kind of chemistry based, but that's kind of how I got into it. And been in it for probably about 35 years.
It's amazing. And you run your own company, Jenadco, which is an amalgamation of the names of Sue's children, everybody, because I did just ask her this question before we started recording. It's like, such a cool, unusual name. But now, health and safety, why should people be worried about it? Obviously, it's a legal obligation, but why, when people ask you, why do I need to worry about health and safety? Tell me what your response is to that normally, Sue, because I feel like that's probably a challenge you get fairly frequently.
Because you can see experiences, but basically the legal obligations are the minimum.
Okay.
So what we're actually finding now with a number of different clients across different sectors, and indeed I've actually worked for one of your members, is that this kind of like magic number of 5, you don't have more than 5 people, nothing has to be written down.
Okay.
Okay, is being taken very differently by insurers. So I actually supported a member who was having difficulty renewing their insurance because the insurers wanted risk assessments written down. They wanted first aid needs assessments written down. So the insurance are actually driving a higher level than the actual legal obligations. So you've obviously got insurance, but if you do apply and you've got systems and you can reassure your insurers, your premiums, there's a good chance that you can reduce your premiums. One of my other clients, a different sector, had just shaved off £10,000 from their insurance premiums. When I worked at Wembley, we actually put some robust health and safety management in place, which wasn't onerous, but we actually really significantly reduced in premium costs. But actually, looking at the sort of staff health and safety, if people are off sick, who's going to kick the work up? It's not a job where you can leave it on your desk. Somebody's got to deal with those horses, carry on to day-to-day business. But also, no one wants to work where it's not safe, poor working conditions. So you're going to go off somewhere and leave. So there's this massive war for talent at the moment. So you can have good members of staff. They'll always get a job, especially in your industry. So you want to retain your staff and you want them working well. If people are actually being looked after and the well-being's good, then they're more productive. So there's a lot of cost savings. I mean, just to recruit and train a new member of staff is a significant cost. And also timely. It takes a long time to get somebody up to speed.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Definitely. It's also really, it's important people feel and are protected and well looked after, and it's part of kind of employee well-being and health and happiness in general. Like, a safe workplace is a happy workplace, because like you said, nobody wants to work in a place where they don't feel safe, and horses are inherently dangerous as it is, so
and you've got claims as well. I mean, the health and safety, the law is slightly different to ordinary law. So you're almost, the onus is on the employer to prove that they put everything in place to reduce the risk of injury or ill health. Some of the other things that we don't think about perhaps so much is, as soon as you mention health and safety and sort of the equestrian sector, everyone jumps down the safety line.
yeah.
But with my background, I've been an occupational health advisor as well. I mean, my hygiene background, it's all of these other hazards that perhaps we don't see, that perhaps we're not aware of. So you've got all of your fungal spores, your dusts, your dander, all causing issues. You've got lots of different chemicals you're using. But because it's not a direct injury, you can't see it. So it's really important that these risks are actually controlled, because you almost open claims, especially with the freelance community. You can't prove that, you haven't got the documentation. You're on a get off your back foot. As soon as claims start getting paid, then up go the insurance premiums.
I mean, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because you kind of got, let's call it the negative obligations of avoiding a claim and keeping your staff, but actually the positives of you can help, potentially save money on insurance premiums. You can keep really good people. You can have an excellent workforce who are accident, injury and problem free from a health perspective, certainly from your doing anyway. And, I think it can be viewed so much more positively than the lens through which it normally is. We often have this thing of, oh, it's such a hassle, I don't want to do that. I've only got to do it because it's a box ticking exercise. Whereas actually a kind of well-run health and safety program is actually a really good way to optimize your workplace to make it a place that people want to come to.
But it's also the operational efficiencies. If you have an accident or there's problems, then with, disruptions, delays, and it's reputation as well. Reputation is really key to your, members.
Mm-hmm.
If you've got, a stud where there's lots of accidents, people are not going to want to engage with it. So, the whole reputational thing can be absolutely huge. It can actually have a massive implication on the success of business.
And we all know this is an industry in which people talk and reputations carry. So everybody knows where the places are where things happen. So definitely, I think that's an interesting point, Sue, actually.
And it's, it's something that, you've got a whole marketing department actually, busily marketing, and it's all going out the window because you're having accidents.
But I think also you mentioned before when we were chatting that the perceptions of things like safety clothing it's about your whole shtick, for want of a better phrase, is changing the perception of health and safety and therefore having a positive impact on people's business. Do you want to just talk a little bit about that, how challenging that has been and how things have changed, Sue? Because I think a lot of us think about health and safety in probably a slightly dated way.
I mean, we're all bored. Since someone mentions health and safety, even me, on safety. And unfortunately, over the years, it has got quite a bad reputation. But it's about actually, rather than seeing health and safety as something separate, embedding it into your everyday processes and actually make them much more efficient. Looking for the win-wins, not actually inundating people with loads of paperwork they don't need. You won't get any prizes or with the health and safety executive for 35-page risk assessment, especially if you're not following them. So it's actually being, proportionate and sensible. But, since you mentioned health and safety, we talked about safety boots. There's still very much a perception of, oh, they're really uncomfortable, they're really expensive. They're not anymore. They've moved on. But unfortunately, people's perception hasn't moved on. I've got some really comfy safety trainers. I spent a week last summer running up Ibiza Castle with the all week. So things have kind of changed. But it's actually, with health and safety, it needs to be aligned. Every business is slightly different. You can't have a one size fits all, even in the same industry. You've got different ways of working, different operations, different staff requirements. But it's also about making sure that your staff actually understand the health and safety. Don't give them loads of jargon. We don't have time. Trying to make things a bit more digital.
It's all useful. And what about, so you've worked extensively in racing and breeding with both the TBA and beyond, and you're an equestrian enthusiast in general, so I think it's fair to say. I should say, and I will plug this at the end, but our members get a free half-an-hour consultation with Sue. So if you are listening to this and you have not uptaken that as a member benefit and you're a full member of the TBA, ring Sue up and get your half an hour booked in, because even if you don't need to progress on to anything else, you can get so much done in 30 minutes in terms of finding out some tailored, specific advice for you and your farm or your stud, and just knowing what you need to know and where your gaps might be that you might need to fill, or otherwise having a big pat on the back that you're doing really well. But definitely uptake that. But what I was going to say off the back of that, Sue, is you've got lots of equestrian experience. What are the kind of particular things that someone who's new to health and safety who might be listening to this should be thinking about in the first instance?
I think one of the main things is risk assessments. We'll go, we do risk assessments every day. Cross our roads a risk assessment, driving a car. And as soon as we ask people to write them down, but we do it naturally, So it's actually getting some risk assessment. It's actually understanding what can cause harm. So we only have to worry about things that are significant. So, minor things we're not. But I think some of, really actually understanding where your hazards are within your operation, how you're controlling them, and getting those written down. Another thing that quite often is an issue is fire safety.
Okay.
Fire is a huge problem within the equestrian industry. You've got so much that can burn. You've got quite a few sources of ignition. Even the weather, drying things out, is a problem. I had a case where somebody parked a car too close to a barn, and the sun shone on the mirror,
Oh my goodness.
which was telling me I burnt the barn down.
No.
And that was just somebody parking. It wasn't a match. It wasn't a cigarette. And you do get sneaky smokers. You do get cooking, especially sort of like, during foaling season when people are up at night trying to heat things up, having to go in. Then you've got heaters. How many of your members know where the nearest hydrant is? Because in the cities, there's hydrants that fire engines plug in and fight the fires. But out in some of the rural areas, there are no hydrants. So you only had the water that they turn up with. So that's a big issue, is actually thinking about fire safety. How can I make that safer? And also first aid. Some of your members might not have loads of people. How do we manage first aid? Like the organisation that I helped was only 2 of them. So it wasn't appropriate to train everyone in first aid because there's probably a 50% chance come on with the injured. But actually knowing where the nearest hospital is, having a first aid box, most people treat themselves, know where the nearest minor injury is, just making sure that you've actually sort of thought. Most of health and safety is just proper planning, but and just really understanding. Having some really good, useful yard rules, especially when you've got visitors, separating, how are you separating your transport, calling your people, not letting public and stuff go wandering through the fields, which does happen. But if everyone actually knows what the expectations are. And we've also put together, as well as this half-an-hour consultation, I have been working with the TBA. So on the actual TBA website, under the members area, is the under the employment bit in HR, we have put together a sample template for a health and safety induction.
You're doing my job for me, Sue. I was going to talk about this at the end, so it's perfect that you've brought this up. Go on, health and safety induction. It's super useful. Go on.
It's not loads of words, but it covers the basics.
Yeah.
Go through with new members. And we've also got some health and safety information sheets that are written in plain English so that everyone can actually understand their responsibilities. So they're all available on the website, but we haven't really publicised that too much.
No, and that's definitely why today's conversation is super worthwhile, because having a free half an hour with you is one thing, but actually if you need something quickly, just logging into the members area of the TBA website, there's a lot of information there. We have a lot of resources on that website, some of which we have referred to before in this podcast, but definitely the health and safety ones that Sue has contributed towards is very, very useful. So, and we've mentioned about people getting in touch with you. Do you want to talk a little bit about how, if people are interested in chatting to you, Sue, what's the best way for them to get hold of you?
They just email the TBA.
Okay.
And then the details come through. And then just arrange an appointment with the individual once it's gone. It goes via the TBA first, then comes to me.
Perfect.
Now I could be super flexible because I know that people are busy working all day, so I don't mind evening, weekend calls. I can actually sort of work around the members.
Yeah,
is what I have with my other clients.
Yeah, definitely. She's a hardworking woman, everybody, who really understands what it's like to have horses.
Yeah, arranges up at 2:00 in the afternoon.
Yeah.
There's no, members should use this half an hour because there's no such thing as a sort of like stupid question. It might be something that just a very minor question that you need to ask. We'll have some clarification on, and we're there to help.
But I think also the example of when we were laughing about safety boots, because I was saying my first pair of steel toe cat wellies was an absolute horror show. It was awful. But, and that was a long time ago, everybody. But things have moved on. And I think keeping just tiny things like having good clothing, lots of people, everybody in this industry wears a hat when you're riding, but just knowing what you might need for your team that will just help things go smoothly on a day-to-day basis. And the fire is a really good example of something you just might not have front of mind all the time. We all hope that never happens, but until it does, it's just not something that often everybody has given a ton of consideration to. So I think it's just these little things that then you can think about, put measures in place. It doesn't have to cost anything necessarily, but at least you've thought about it and you know where your nearest hospital is or where your nearest hygienist is, whatever it is. Small tips like that, Sue, is basically the way forward for creating an excellent workplace, isn't it?
And with the fire, if you've done some pre-plan, which cost anything, but where's your evacuation plan? Where do people go? Where are you going to put the horses? A fire will double its size every 10 seconds. You don't have a lot of time with what's going to burn earlier, but it means that can mean a difference between saving people and animals.
Yeah. And it's interesting because a few of us were recently at a conference where the Australian TBA gave a presentation about the wildfires in Australia last year and the scale of that and the speed at which it moved through one particular very big stud yard and yard is terrifying. And I think actually having thought about those things and thinking about evacuation plans and just thinking ahead, I guess, just allows people to have good plans in place so that if and when the worst happens, which God forbid it does, you know what you're doing and your team are prepped and you're prepped as well as a person listening to this.
This is where you can have issues as well. I mean, there was a legal requirement to have a fire risk assessment principles. And this is where you have issues when you don't have your health and safety in order and we go to make an insurance claim, because these are all legal obligations. And if you haven't got things in place, then they're less likely to pay out. But also, with health and safety legislation, there's a legal requirement to comply with all these things. We try and make it as painless as possible. But if you're not compliant, you are actually not insured, because it's a criminal offence not to comply with a piece of legislation. And you can't insure against a criminal offence. So, that's another, and in this day and age where there are so many hoops of insurers to jump through, it is a bit of an issue. The health and safety executive, who are they're the enforcers that can actually come in at any time. They have more rights of entry than the police.
Wow.
Yep. Oh, yes. They have pledged to do, I think, 14,500 ad hoc visits to businesses across the UK this year, and they are going to be focusing on stress and fatigue, but also on dust and ergonomics. And these are all quite prevalent hazards within your industry that can be controlled quite easily. Even if someone wants some advice on which dust mask do I need.
Yeah. Small things.
I've got a member that is coughing.
Yeah.
My team is coughing, and is this okay? Or someone's pregnant.
Yeah.
Quick fixes.
Absolutely. And all really, really essential in terms of just knowing. So if you are listening to this and you haven't yet scribbled some notes or picked up the phone, drop us an email to info@thetba.co.uk and we can set that up for you, no problem. As I've said on a couple of occasions, it is one of the very many member benefits that you get with the TBA, which we would love you to utilise for you and for your team and for the good health of the industry and for all our good health too. Anyway, Sue, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to chat. Very grateful, and we will see you soon, no doubt.
In the next conversation, you'll hear me talking about worming to Professor Jane Hodgkinson from the University of Liverpool. But before that, I wanted to really quickly let you know about a couple of ongoing veterinary research projects investigating wormer resistance that are currently going on. One led by Katie Bull at the University of Bristol, which is an HBLB funded study on small redworm resistance, those are cyathostomes, and the other from Nick Steele at the University of Liverpool, who is undertaking a study funded by the VMD on large roundworm resistance, that's ascarids, if you've heard that one before. If your stud or anyone you know is experiencing drug resistance involving these parasites, so that's small redworms or large roundworms, you are really welcome to get in touch with us here at the TBA so that we can link you to the correct team. If you do take part in one of these studies, you may well be eligible for free of charge fecal worm egg counts, which is hopefully a nice little incentive. So have a think about that one.
But there's a few new things just come out, and the first thing that Jane and I are going to touch on is an update to the consensus documents that come from Canter. These are super useful, and they were just released a couple of weeks ago. So before we crack into that, Jane, can you just give us a little very brief flavour of what Canter is for anyone that hasn't heard of it?
Yeah, so Canter was put together, it started in 2021, and the idea was that we brought people from across the sector who have an interest in improving the control of parasites in horses. And they represent diverse groups, and we wanted lots of differences of opinion so we could reach a consensus around some of the important ways in which anthelmintic drugs are used, some of the non-chemical ways we control parasites, thinking about different age groups and bringing in different expertise so we can focus on those most vulnerable or at-risk age groups. So really it was to try and make recommendations for the sector and provide guidelines so that people could have a useful resource to go to. They could check those details out on the Canter website and feel informed either as a horse owner to go to their prescriber, SQP or vet and ask questions, or as an SQP to give you a background so you can better prescribe your anthelmintics and those conversations you have at the point of sale, or as a vet, also use them as a resource just to update your knowledge and look at some of the sort of current recommendations that are coming out from experts in the field. So multiple purposes, one document with lots of different chapters and hopefully broken down by chapter so you can engage with the relevant sections. But really the overall objective is to try and control parasites better and improve the health and welfare of horses by doing that in a way that does not select more strongly for resistance or allow resistance to develop more rapidly than it's already occurring.
Yeah, perfect. For anyone listening, that is canterforhorses.org.uk is the website if you want to go and have a look. SQPs, if you haven't heard of them before, is a suitably qualified person, and they are allowed to prescribe this sort of stuff. So if you are looking for wormers or anthelmintic treatment, there's various ways you can get it. So we have just had some updates to a couple of those documents, Jane. You mentioned young stock on studs, we were just chatting about before we started recording, is a major area of worming concern, I guess, and need for people listening to this podcast. Can you talk a little bit about the new consensus document that's come out about young stock and what might be new with regarding all of that?
Yeah, I can. So in putting the Canter documents together, we do have general documents around how anthelmintics are used. And we do have really important documents around sustainable control, where you're possibly using anthelmintic drugs, but your focus is also on non-chemical means of control. What the young stock section was done, the chapter that focuses exclusively on young stock, we needed that because we recognise that that's a different cohort of animals, that they have different factors that feed into why they might be more at risk of getting heavy parasitic burdens, that they experience multiple parasites in their first few years of life, and they're often the most intensively treated and have the sort of, if you like, there's a slightly higher risk of driving resistance in those cohorts through anthelmintic use. So we felt there had to be a young stock specific section so that we could balance all of those things and provide some really useful guidelines to say, okay, how should we approach this? If we look at mature horses, the emphasis is all on assessing the risk of their environment that it poses to them. Now, with young stock, we can integrate risk, but we have to bear in mind other factors. They're at greater risk by virtue of their age. So we had to then think about the practicalities of balancing risk with diagnostics, with treatment decisions. So there's a table in there, and it's chapter 11 on the Canter website. There's a really useful table in there. First of all, we define different age groups of animals from a parasitic point of view, because that allows us to both think of the risk that's posed by the virtue of them being that age, and then which parasites they might encounter at that age, because the drugs you might use for some parasites are different to the drugs and control measures you might use for other parasites. So that table does focus largely on foals, and we define foals in the age we mean, weanlings, and then we move into our young stock cohorts. So we've broken it down like that, and what you can see is your full age group, something like an ascarid parasite, the roundworm, Parascaris acurus, Parascaris species might be your primary concern in the first few months of life. And in that situation, if you look on the table, you can refer to that table and it will tell you, okay, in this age group of animal, with that parasite, what drug might I choose based on what we currently know about drug resistance? So that's a really useful guide. Then as that animal ages, it's supported later down as they age, and maybe they haven't got the same risk of ascarids anymore, but you're thinking about other parasites like the cythostomins, the small redworm, and your tapeworms. Then you can integrate diagnostics with risk assessment to then make treatment decisions. So whilst in your very youngest animals, you might run diagnostics, but you're probably going to treat anyway because of the risk it poses. In your slightly older animals, you're integrating your risk assessment, your diagnostics, and then that's guiding you to what sort of control measures you should take in terms of treatments. So it's that table, I think, is extremely useful to people. The context around that table is written in the text, but that table is a really useful reference point for people to go to get some very practical guidance. And this is a consensus that's been put together by people with expertise, and it's been reviewed. I don't necessarily put them together, but we review the documents. So we've seen them multiple times and been refined by the whole Canter core steering group. So I think that they are current best guidance for people who are producing animals, and it covers them from, as I say, the first 5 months as foals, between 5 months and a year as weanlings, 12 to 18 months as yearlings, and then beyond 18 months to 5 years as young stock.
Sounds like an incredibly useful resource, and actually having a simple breakdown for people, because worming is one of those things that can seem very complicated to people, I think, and actually quite scary when you start looking into the different types of worms and different ages and different resistances and different drugs. It can be a little bit overwhelming, but actually quite interesting to have a current breakdown of thoughts on resistance or knowledge about resistance as well is absolutely vital, because I think one of the things that we do encounter at the TBA is people knowing sometimes that there is resistance but not knowing what to do about it, or the industry knowing that there is resistance around certain drugs and knowing that they are still being used quite indiscriminately. And I think for people to have that knowledge just as in a very simple table, Jane, is incredibly useful.
Okay, so actually coming to that point, that's really interesting. So in that table, you will see every time a drug is administered, there's a recommendation to follow up with a 14-day post-treatment. Redo that test, redo that fecal egg count 14 days later after treatment. That's a recommendation in that table, because then you know if that drug has worked. Because the reason you're using a drug in most cases is to target the parasites and stop the eggs being shed into the environment. And actually, if the eggs are still there 14 days later, you haven't actually achieved what you set out to achieve with that drug. And that's really important to know. I have to say, we work a lot with studs and young stock, and we know, similarly to what you were just discussing there, there are examples of drugs not working and multi-drug resistant parasites. And that's where the other chapter on non-chemical control becomes really important, because yes, the young stock chapter does talk about this and the fact that drugs should not be used in isolation. We need to be integrating that with other means of trying to reduce transmission of the parasite, picking up poo, ideally. With the studs that we work with, the ones that control the parasites best are those that invest in picking up poo. Picking up poo from fields does a lot of good in reducing transmission. The studs where they've had the greatest problems are where they use the same permanent pastures for the same age group year on year on year. The published study in 2023, we showed that the yearlings that year were carrying drug-resistant redworm parasites, cythostomins, and the following year's foals grazed the same pasture. And when we tested those foals, they also had the drug-resistant parasites. So because it's the pasture that was carrying the parasites, and because they were grazing the same pasture year in, year out, consecutive years, animals,
scary, isn't it?
Young stock were picking up drug-resistant parasites. And that's where your non-chemical control measures become really important. Thinking about the risk that pasture poses. Can you put older stock on there that are less likely to get as heavily infected? Or can you put other animals like sheep or cattle? You have to. The advice is to make sure they're not carrying fluke, because that's the only parasite they can share, liver fluke. But bringing sheep on, grazing sheep onto that pasture, they'll pick up the parasites. They don't get infected by those parasites, so they don't excrete eggs from those parasites, but they do ingest them and pick them up, and they're like hoovers that pick them up off the pasture. So all of those. So I think the young stock chapter is really, really helpful at guiding you to treatment decisions and checking for resistance with diagnostics, and thinking about things like risk that a pasture poses, but it's also really important to bring it together with the non-chemical control chapter, where you're thinking holistically about parasite control rather than just relying on drugs.
So interesting and absolutely essential. And I think there's been a real shift in thinking about non-chemical control, and the fact that we can't always rely on, in this case, anthelmintics or more widely antibiotics as well, that resistance is a problem across a lot of these drugs, and actually having the capacity to think holistically about it in the round. What else can we do? What can we do that doesn't necessarily involve just bunging in wormers on a regular basis, and how we can look after our populations as a result is just absolutely vital, isn't it?
It is, particularly because, I just said in the young stock chapter, some of the youngest animals, regardless of diagnostic tests, we would still recommend a treatment. The point is, there are some cases where you really do want to rely on an effective drug because it's the best option to you. And if we can use non-chemical means of reducing transmission, we can protect the drugs for longer, which means we can preserve them then for when we really do need them. I think, unfortunately, people like me have been saying this for a long time, and the message is getting through to some extent, but we know there are cases of resistance now. And when you're meeting, as we are now, lots of studs who are in a challenging situation with trying to control the parasites with drugs, because the drugs just aren't working anywhere near as well. There are no new drugs coming. So therefore the emphasis has to shift to looking at those non-chemical means, and yes, where the drugs are still working, knowing which drugs are working, and then trying to use them judiciously so you don't overuse them in your young stock. Your foals, your weanlings, your yearlings, and your young stock animals are going to be the ones that are most vulnerable. So you want to be able to preserve the drugs for those age groups.
And interestingly, they've been through this. You mentioned sheep before, but they've been through this in the stock sector, in cattle and sheep for quite a long time. And actually, I suppose there's a lot for us to learn in the equine and in the stud sector from what's happened in farming and changes that have had to occur to do with parasite burdens in sheep in particular. Do you want to just expand on that a little tiny bit, Jane, as well?
Yeah. So SCOPS, which is the equivalent of Canter, Sustainable Control of Parasites in Sheep, has been around, I think, since the mid-2000s, so around 2005. So it's been around a good while. And
it was around when I was at vet school, and that was a really long time ago. So I'm going to say early 2000s is about right.
It's about right, isn't it? So they've been around a good while. And actually, people, I think it takes a few years. We've just refined the Canter documents. They've been through their second, the second version has come out, which I think is an improvement on the first version, because you've got to get your head around everything. You're producing a lot of material, and you've got to produce it in a way that's engaging for people. And I think the current Canter, the sort of second edition version, is really, really good at doing that. Scots have been doing that for a lot longer, and they definitely have changed the way people engage with anthelmintic products across the sheep sector. Again, they've not reached everybody, but they tend to highlight some really good practice. And it's come from exactly the same standpoint, which is that your drugs need to be preserved. It was brought in really because of drug resistance and the sort of first cases of anthelmintic resistance to particularly things like the macrocyclic lactones, things like ivermectin and the other mectins. So it was brought in to try and preserve the drugs for as long as they could. And it has definitely been beneficial in that regard. But also what it's done is educate people more broadly about there are multiple ways of controlling parasites, of which drugs are one aspect. And because with sheep, there's a commercial concern in terms of productivity of those animals, as well as their health and welfare. I think, that's been another driver to make sure that people have engaged with sort of the best practice and the current practice, as well as it being defensible. It's not defensible to use a drug where that there's widespread resistance to it and it might not work in your livestock. That's not good management. So it's understanding that with SCOPS in particular, the sheep sector has really been pushing this forward for a lot longer than the other sectors. Taking that advice, doing the best that you can for your livestock, as well as obviously keeping that the commercial consideration there. And I appreciate for the breeding sector and equines there's that commercial consideration as well. Making sure that you are doing and following best practice it's a defensible argument both for the farmers, the vets, and everyone who's engaged in those processes.
There's a lot to discuss and there's a lot to dive into on this. If you are interested in learning more, there are loads of resources on TBEd. We have had worm workshops, of which there are multiple. There's worming webinars. There's lots. Jane and I are going to come back to discuss about non-chemical options for reducing worm burdens and how we change people's behaviours on that one, because that is a complex and really interesting topic. So I'm going to park that one for now, but it's definitely one to come back to in the future. Jane, thank you very, very much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure to chat to you, and I will look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Thank you.
That's all for today. Thanks so much for listening. You can follow us on Instagram at thetba.gb, and don't forget to tag us in your posts. We're always here to help, so do give us a ring or drop us an email at info@thetba.co.uk if you need anything. We'd love to hear from you. We'll be back in a couple of weeks, and we really hope that you'll join us then.